Singapore is often hailed as one of the most remarkable economic success stories of the 20th century. From being a small island nation with limited natural resources to becoming a global financial and trading hub, Singapore's economic transformation is nothing short of extraordinary. At the heart of this transformation was a man named Kuan Yew, who is known as Singapore's founding Prime Minister. Kuan Yew revolutionized Singapore. He laid down the necessary leadership and economic policies to propel the island nation to where it is today. But just what are the economic policies he specifically implemented? And what did the overall economic performance look like under his tenure? Well, to understand this, let's first talk about what Singapore was like in the very beginning. When Singapore gained independence in 1965, the island nation faced a lot of challenges. Challenges that weren't really small. They were the reasons behind Singapore's status as a third world country back then. Singapore's unemployment rate back then was very high, and poverty was seen in many urban areas. Furthermore, Singapore was but an island with just 738 square kilometres and very scarce natural resources, especially fresh water. There was ethnic tensions and fragile social cohesion, and the fact that Southeast Asia, the region where Singapore resided in, was fraught with regional challenges. So, what did he do to fix these issues? Well, there were three main components that Kuan Yew pursued: global trade and investment, political stability and the rule of law, and education and skills development. Each of these had their own specific policies that occurred beneath them. Let's first talk about global trade and investment. Singapore's trade and investment under Kuan Yew saw an extraordinary rise. What Kuan Yew specifically did to make this happen was that he introduced economic policies to attract multinational corporations. Back then, Singapore was a source of cheap labour and had better infrastructures than its neighbouring countries. Singapore was also offering tax incentives, which was necessary for many global corporations. This has then led many major companies to open up business in Singapore in the 1970s. This is evidently seen in the Jurong Industrial Estate, which was established in 1961, which a decade later saw over 300 factories producing goods like textiles, chemicals, and electronics. Here's a graph on Singapore's exports of goods and services from 1960 to 1990, data that we collected from the World Bank. As you can see, Singapore's exports under Kuan Yew were growing minimally from 1960 to 1970. But after the Jurong Industrial Estate receiving billions of investments, and Lee's economic policies had started to take effect, the exports of goods and services started to grow. And by 1980, exports stood at $24 billion, an increase from $1.15 billion in 1960. Additionally, foreign direct investments, FDI, was very high during those periods. It was a reflection of Kuan Yew's policies to attract multinational corporations. Here's a graph with data that we collect from the World Bank on Singapore's foreign direct investments, net inflows as a percentage of GDP. You can see that in the 1970s to 1990s, Singapore's FDI inflows as a percentage of GDP has been fluctuating. But in some years, they were as much as 11.7%, such as the one in 1981. But you wouldn't really appreciate just how big these are until you actually compare them to other economies. Here's another graph, but this time we add Malaysia, South Korea, and Hong Kong. As you can see from 1970 to 1990, Singapore's FDI as a percentage of GDP was outpacing all of these countries in every single year, except for Hong Kong. This is a reflection of just how much investments were flowing inside Singapore as compared to these other economies. Beyond exports and foreign investments, infrastructure was also a significant part of Kuan Yew's economic policies. Under his administration, The Changi Airport was opened, the Port of Singapore was modernized, and many other infrastructures were built. These infrastructures were crucial in propelling Singapore to become a leader in global trade and a major aviation hub. But just how much did they invest? Well, one of the measures we can use is the concept called gross fixed capital formation. It is a measure of the net increase in physical assets within an economy, encompassing investments in infrastructure, machinery, equipment, and buildings. Here's a graph with data that we collected from the World Bank on that matter. As you can see, their gross fixed capital formation as a percentage of GDP was outpacing other Asian economies by a lot. You can even see it the most from 1981 to 1983, the years that saw a lot of infrastructures, buildings, and other physical assets that rose up in Singapore. You can clearly see that not only in these comparative countries with Hong Kong, Malaysia, and South Korea, but in a long list of other major economies out there. Other than infrastructures, another significant achievement of Kuan Yew was that he emphasized education as a critical enabler of economic growth. Schools focused on practical skills, particularly in engineering and technology. But what's interesting about education in Singapore is that it actually lagged behind compared to other economies in terms of government spending. Here's a graph on public spending on education as a share of GDP, data that we collected from the World Bank. As you can see, Singapore isn't heavily invested as much as Malaysia. While overall it was above Hong Kong during Kuan Yew's tenure, Hong Kong would eventually surpass that of Singapore. Same can be said for South Korea. Despite that, Singapore still boasts higher productivity levels as compared to these economies, as measured by the GDP per capita. You can see that in this graph right here on Singapore's GDP per capita. This is arguably the most important indicator that we will come across today, as it captures the economic output generated per person in the country, providing a snapshot of how productive the average Singaporean is compared to those in other economies. This metric also reflects the effectiveness of Singapore's policies in transforming its labour force, infrastructure and institutions into a cohesive and highly productive economic system. As you can see in the graph right here, data that we collected from the World Bank, Singapore's GDP per capita in 1965 was just $615, a figure that wasn't that big of a difference when you compare it to Malaysia, which had $326 at that time. A lot of other Southeast Asian economies also had similar GDP per capita numbers to that of Singapore. But, as you can see from an extended graph right here until 1990, Singapore's GDP per capita would make all the Southeast Asian economies' productivity levels look poor in comparison. Furthermore, Singapore has much more researchers in their population than most other economies out there like Hong Kong and Malaysia, and only lags behind South Korea. So, why is Singapore's public spending so low, yet its productivity, number of researchers, and overall economic output better? Well, this is largely due to the efficiency of its policies and the private sector's significant involvement in education and research. Kuan Yew's government prioritized outcomes over input, focusing on creating an education system aligned with the demands of the global economy. By emphasizing quality over quantity, the Singaporean education model tailored curricula to develop a skilled workforce, especially in STEM fields, science, technology, engineering and mathematics, which were critical for attracting and retaining multinational corporations. Now, the result of these educational investments and foreign investments led to a decrease in one of Singapore's biggest problems that we mentioned earlier, unemployment. Here's a graph on Singapore's unemployment rate from 1970 to 1990. As you can see, Singapore's unemployment rate has continuously fluctuated over the years. But in most of these years, the unemployment rate has dropped to low single digits, with the years where it saw high unemployment rate due to financial and global issues. Finally, the last economic performance indicator that we will use today is none other than the GDP annual growth. It is the most important economic indicator out there because it measures the overall expansion of an economy within a year, reflecting how effectively the country is utilizing its resources to generate wealth. While GDP per capita showcases productivity on an individual level, annual GDP growth highlights the broader economic momentum. Here's the graph, with data that we collected from the World Bank on that matter. As you can see, Singapore's GDP annual growth has overshadowed that of Malaysia and many other Southeast Asian economies. But when we compare it to Hong Kong, Singapore's annual growth remains competitive. From 1960 to 1990, the average annual GDP growth of Singapore stood at 8.6%, whereas Malaysia was at 6.9%, Hong Kong at 8.2%, and South Korea at 9.6%. Even though it is not the fastest in terms of annual GDP growth, Singapore, as the 21st century comes, and with the latest year available, would eventually show that their GDP per capita is so much higher than all of these economies. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.